Welcome back. So it's time now for the ministerial round table on topics like resilience, recovery, preparedness. As we know, the corona crisis hit the tourism industry in many countries around the world harder than average, thereby weakening the economic performance of states, causing company bankruptcies, increasing unemployment and debt levels. So when we were planning this session, we naturally wanted to focus on the role of policymakers in mitigating the fallout from the pandemic, thus safeguarding and building tourism industry resilience. But as we all know, we now have another world crisis on our hands, namely the war in Ukraine, including the international fallout involved with it. So how do we approach this session? We were discussing that for a very long time because, after all, a pandemic and a war involve different challenges. Or do they? Because ultimately, and now putting aside the human and political challenges of these crises just for a moment, what unites them both is a common denominator, and that is unpredictability. And for the worldwide tourism industry, it's unpredictability that causes by far the most damage for both the tourists and, of course, the industry, the service providers, the hotels, you name it. And with this, a very warm welcome again to the ITB Ministerial Roundtable entitled From COVID to Climate Crisis and Ukraine, are policies in place to minimize crises' impact on travel and tourism. Now, shortly, we will welcome 3 ministers, representatives from various major tourist destinations. But first, on behalf of the ITB organizers and the Global Travel and Tourism Resilience Council, I would like to thank them for inviting Ms. Julia Simpson, the CEO and President of the World Travel and Tourism Council, to discuss with us the state of preparedness of the global travel industry. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the WTTC President and CEO, Julia Simpson. Julia Simpson, so very good to have you on board, to see you join us here at ITB 2022 in Berlin. Now, given the fact, the years of the pandemic, of course, and the pandemic sadly still is with us, the virus hasn't quite disappeared just yet, and all of that running in parallel to the global climate crisis, now we have a state of war on Europe's doorstep, something that none of us would have thought would be possible, certainly not in our lifetime. What has been done throughout the industry to address crisis preparedness?
Well, first of all, guten Tag. Thank you very much for inviting me to the wonderful ITB conference that is being so well organized. Yes, I would like to begin by saying that I think all our hearts go out to the people who are suffering currently in the Ukraine, and I'm sure we all feel the same. We're watching our television screens every day, and some of the images are truly horrific. And I would call, obviously, for Ukrainians and for Russians who believe that this is the wrong thing to have happened, that we all stand for peace and we all respect the sovereignty of each other's countries. So I just wanted to begin by that, because I'm sure we're all feeling the same thing, and our solidarity is with them at the moment. Just going on to travel and tourism, before we get on to the Ukraine and the impact that that has had, travel and tourism suffered very severely during the pandemic. If you think that global GDP was affected by about 3.7%, travel and tourism, its value to GDP, was affected by nearly 50%. We saw the loss of 62 million jobs globally, and a 9.2 trillion global business saw 50%, as I said, wiped off that number. And what does that mean? That meant that a lot of businesses, as you were saying earlier, went bust. People lost their jobs. In Europe, we were obviously luckier in the sense that a lot of governments put in a lot of support through furlough schemes. And I'm very grateful to ministers today for all the work that they did in lobbying to ensure that there was that safety net. I think, you have to accept that travel and tourism was the hardest hit of all sectors, but it does have a reputation for great resilience. My one major concern at the moment is the price of Brent jet fuel, Brent crude. We've gone up to records of $140 a barrel. This is unprecedented. We haven't seen numbers like this since the financial crash many years ago. And this won't just impact on airlines, it's going to impact obviously on the whole economy, and that will impact on travel and tourism.
And of course, this could get worse as there are talks about a possible oil embargo. And we have to really prepare for the worst here. And as you mentioned already, I mean, tourism, the travel and tourism sector has always been stepping up to whatever crisis there was. Right now, a lot of parts of the tourism sector, again, stepping up, helping those tourists stranded because of the war in Ukraine, or even taking them in, the refugees who are coming over. And you also mentioned how hard hit the tourism sector as a whole was. What can the WTTC do? What kind of guidelines can you give in order to help this already battered sector stepping up in this time of crisis?
Yes, thank you. Well, just before I turn to the Ukraine and what we can do and what all our members are doing, the WTTC represents 200 of the top global travel and tourism companies. So many of them are finding themselves caught with businesses in Russia, businesses in Ukraine, businesses in Poland. And I'll come on to that in a second. We did pre-Ukraine do some very interesting research with Oxford Economics to look like what could 2022 do? How could it come back? And the truth is that government ministers now, fortunately, have focused much more closely on individual risk of travellers. Closing frontiers, we always argued that a virus does not respect a frontier. The WHO always said it wasn't an effective way of controlling COVID. What it did do is it caused a lot of panic, it caused a lot of confusion, and that is probably why our sector was worst hit. If you just look at Europe, there were lots of different policies, and even though the EU did try and mandate some kind of harmonisation in terms of restrictions, it didn't really happen in reality. They were brilliant. The EU have been brilliant at the EU travel pass, and I think the EU travel pass could be something going forward that really liberates the way that we travel. But if we just look at numbers for a second, the real winners at the moment would be the US. The US currently looks like by the end of 2022, it will recover. I've just written a number down here. It's GDP value of travel and tourism in 2019 pre-pandemic was $1.87 trillion. And that looks like that could go back up to 2. So they will actually exceed. Globally, it looks like by the end of 2022, in a best case scenario, we could recover at about 6% below where we were in 2019. And if we look at Europe, that's about 12% below. Obviously, Asia Pac is taking a while to open up, but even then, China, because it's had such a strong domestic market, it looks very, very positive. And it looks like it will almost get back to pre-pandemic levels as well by the end of 2022 in terms of its contribution to global GDP. So those are some of the numbers. I just wanted to talk about Ukraine because I've been speaking to some of our members that have properties, hotels. We have amazing work that's going on the ground. We have Accor, some of you made the group, Radisson, Hilton, all of these are members, and they're finding that in the Ukraine, where they're trying to keep hotels open, they have about 25% of people there are sort of trapped tourists, as you said, people who've just got caught there for various reasons. Another 25% are journalists, another 25% are NGOs, like Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières, and then there's another, we even have NATO witnesses, you know, the witnesses that are coming to see what is actually happening on the ground. So it's critical that these places are staying open, and people are really very, very courageous, very brave. I know some hotels in Kiev at the moment only have 3 days left of food supplies, but they are trying to get food through. So they're playing a critical role. And then, as you quite rightly said, for the refugees, again, I spoke to somebody who they've just opened all their hotels in Poland, close to the border, to refugees.
Right.
And they're, giving them food and sustenance and support and general kind of love. And it's very, very true. Our industry really steps up in a crisis.
That is amazing. That is highly commendable and truly heartwarming in the face of this terrible time in need. I have one last question for you, Julia, because you have a very difficult task facilitating certainly the balance within the private sector of travel providers, destinations. Crisis preparedness is not necessarily something that the industry likes to talk about. It doesn't really go well with selling the idea of a carefree holiday. How can policymakers, because I'm going to speak to some now, how can policymakers assist you in your long-time message about the need for preparation to ensure industry resilience?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you there, because I think our industry is very, very good at preparing for crisis. And during COVID, some of the hotels, I was talking to hoteliers, for example, in the Caribbean, they became hubs for educating about the vaccines. They used their own ambassadors on the ground to encourage families who may have felt a bit reticent, and supply lines about taking the vaccination. They became centres of excellence. And I think, if anything, if you look at cruise lines, we have an incredible record of preparing for the worst. Now, you're absolutely right. We don't necessarily put that on the front of every ticket as people arrive. But I want people to rest assured that when they walk into a hotel room, when they get on a cruise line, when they go to a resort, they're in some of the safest places they will ever be in terms of safety, security, hygiene. What we really learned through this crisis, though, is how, and this is a phrase that's often used and it doesn't mean anything, but it really meant something here. And that was the private sector and the politicians in the States really joined together, and we worked together. We worked together so effectively. We broke down barriers between the two of us so effectively. I've heard some hoteliers say that they now think they could move on to other issues like solving crime in the local area, because the relationships that they've established have been so powerful. And of course, it's in a crisis where you establish long-term relationships of trust and reliability.
Well, that is an unexpected yet extremely pleasant upside to the pandemic, to a terrible crisis, that this kind of cooperation and collaboration between private sector, the industry and policymakers worked out so well. Julia Simpson there, President and CEO of WTTC. Thank you so much for your time, because now I would like to have a word or two with our ministers. So thank you so much, Julia Simpson.
Thank you.